Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast, where we visit with leaders who are shaping, innovating, and disrupting technical education. People who are not afraid to think differently, not afraid to try something new, all with the goal of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. Securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. I am your host, Matt Kirkner. This is the Tech Ed Podcast, where we talk to people who are disrupting technical education, innovating technical education, and thinking about that next generation the whole way. Today, we have a guest that is doing that at an extremely high and an extremely influential level. Congressman Frank Lucas from the great state of Oklahoma, who, among other things, chairs the U.S. House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, joins me as our guest. Congressman, thank you so much for taking some time.
Thank you, Matt, for the opportunity to be with you. And as I remind people, I serve on a number of committees. I've chaired a committee before this, the Ag Committee, Science, Space, and Technology Committees, the fun committee. It's the future. It's everything.
Absolutely. And if memory serves, Congressman, you're actually the longest serving committee member on the Agriculture Committee, I believe, if that's not correct. And so
absolutely.
So appreciate all your service in all those endeavors. And I think that's actually a perfect segue into where I wanted to start the conversation, because your family has been farming the amazing state of Oklahoma for over 100 years. I think I read somewhere 120 years, 5 generations in Oklahoma agriculture. And I've got a little bit of an ag background myself. I did not grow up on a farm. Both of my parents did. They have 17 siblings between them, most of whom were farmers. So I grew up in and around farming, not in the way that you did necessarily, but certainly with an understanding of the incredible value that it provides to us here in the United States. Now, that is a world that is changing considerably, this world of agriculture, this world of farming. And I'd be interested, Congressman, as we start out, talk a little bit about how science and technology and the work of agriculture is changing in this day and age.
Oh, absolutely, Matt. And let me note for the record, when I started out farming in the 1970s, I farmed with one of my grandfathers, and both of them had started with horses and mules.
Wow.
My grandfather, Lucas, was born in Indiana on a corn farm not far from the banks of the Wabash River in northern Indiana. My other grandfather, Fred Adderholt, was raised on a cotton farm outside of Corsicana, Texas, in southeastern Texas. So we went from their generation of walking behind those plows to my generation when I started in the 70s and 80s. And now the level of technology, Matt, involved in production agriculture, precision agriculture, as we like to call it on the farm, if it were not for the satellites, if it were not for all of the electronic equipment, a truly aggressive farmer now would not be able to function, because the efficiency that it brings in the application of seeds, fertilizers, chemicals, pesticides is really phenomenal.
Absolutely. It's absolutely incredible. You think about all that technology, from drone technology, satellite technology, smart sensors and smart devices that we talk about all the time here on the Tech Ed Podcast. That world has completely changed. And I think in a lot of ways, Congressman, changed the way that we need to create this next generation of almost technologists for the world of precision agriculture. And I love that term, by the way. So talk a little bit about your views on, in as much as the committee you chair now is certainly huge into science, huge into technology. It's got it right in its name. And I know a number of the endeavors you're involved with are how we create this next generation of STEM talent. So in your mind, Congressman, is agriculture STEM education?
Oh, absolutely. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics, every skill set, from the technicians who service the satellite receivers, who service the computer setups on the tractors and the harvesting equipment, to the people who design and build this, whether it's green or red paint or some other color, the engineers who put all that together, it is the whole package. It's not, as my grandfather's generation would have said, baling wire and duct tape anymore to hold everything together. Servicing that equipment and staying current and making sure that our bandwidth is available,
right,
so that when the equipment goes into the field, it works correctly, is a big part of that, Matt. But yes, and it is a struggle. Ask any implement dealer, do you have enough people who can work on this equipment? And they'll say, no.
Right.
And we will train people. We will pay them to be apprentices. We will do all sorts of things to secure them. But there's just not enough folks. And that in my role on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee is what brought me initially into the STEM work in the very beginning. When I was vice chairman of the committee, I had a very wonderful and dynamic ranking member by the name of Eddie Bernice Johnson, who was very focused on these issues. And after Lamar Smith, who was a great chairman, retired, control of Congress flipped. So instead of being the chairman for 4 years, I was the ranking member.
Sure.
And EBJ, as I affectionately call her, was the chairman. And we had this understanding. She was very focused on underserved communities, underserved STEM, and I was very focused on rural STEM. Because whether you live in an inner city or you're out in the countryside, having access to opportunities, Matt, is really challenging. So we worked then, and I do still with my ranking member, Congresswoman Lofgren from California, to make sure that everybody has an opportunity. And that is encouraging business. And depending on what state you're in, career tech or some similar kind of educational institution, to make the investments in these courses. A lot of kids, by that I use the phrase from high school on up, a lot of young people for that matter, Matt, never really have an exposure to this, so they don't know what the opportunities are, and which, by the way, are great economic opportunities too, not just the joy of working hard, but the ability to make good money.
Absolutely. One of the things I love about your answer, and is in as much as so many of us can disagree on so many things, I really do find that technical education, finding opportunities for that next generation, whether it's a rural young individual that's growing up on a farm in Oklahoma or somebody else that's maybe growing up in a challenging urban environment, making sure all of those folks have exactly the same opportunities, because you're right, these are incredible opportunities to earn a great living, to have a really interesting job, to be open to promotion, to have an employer maybe continue to pay to educate you over the course of your career. So very, very exciting times. And I want to dive in a little bit deeper on that rural front. You mentioned that grandfather Lucas, if I'm not mistaken, grew up in Indiana. I actually owned a manufacturing plant in Indiana for a number of years before getting out of that world a few years ago. We had Senator Todd Young on with us going back about 4, 5, 6 months ago to talk all about the CHIPS and Science Act. And of course, he's the senator from Indiana, a huge advocate for that act. And I know that was a huge part of your work as well, Congressman. So let's talk about one element of that being the Rural STEM Education Act, which is part of the CHIPS and Science Act. And talk to us about that act and what it seeks to accomplish and how it fits into when we think about chips. Maybe many people, their brain goes to things like microprocessors and high tech, but talk about that relationship as well.
First, Matt, let's talk for a moment about the CHIPS and Science Act. The CHIPS part of the CHIPS and Science Act was an effort to make sure that not only would we stop falling behind at some of our very aggressive competitors in the world, I think we can use the phrase China, but that we also be able to move forward and recoup a lot of the momentum that we had in the past. But the chip side was about using present technology to build present technologically based factories to produce these chips. The science side of the equation, which by the way, was added to create the critical mass to drive the whole bill across the finish line. The science section is about the next level of technology. How do we build the next factory? What are we going to build in that factory and move forward from there? The resources are provided to states. There's incentives to encourage business to participate in these programs. But the bottom line ultimately will be when we have the ability to fill every position that industry has open out there. And coming from manufacturing, as you well know too, almost in every sector of the technology industry, in anything related to STEM, there's jobs that go wasted because they can't find people to fill the spots.
Exactly. It's fascinating and it's scary all at the same time. We had Asatosh Patti, who's the managing director of McKinsey and Company, is certainly a consulting company well known to you and to our listeners on a couple of weeks ago, talking about, I think his number, Congressman, was $2.1 trillion of GDP that we have foregone over the course of the last 10 years because of the fact that we couldn't fill those positions. So I think that's really resonating.
Exactly. And as I point out, I'm the guy who represents Northwest Oklahoma. So people think of me as the country congressman, but I also represent South Oklahoma City, an inner city, culturally diverse area. It's a place where many people never had a chance to go to college, certainly not to go to career tech, never had those advanced opportunities. They're very focused on making sure their children had the opportunities that they did not have. And let's be honest, you don't have to have a master's or a PhD in electrical engineering to work in this industry. Career tech, which we have in Oklahoma, typically a year or two's training, or community colleges have stepped into this fold too, enabling people at a relatively cost-effective way to immediately go to work. And if you enjoy it, there's nothing limiting people in the STEM sciences from advancing further if they choose to. It's just that I call it the first step on the ladder of economic and personal opportunity to advance up. And it doesn't matter what you look like. It doesn't matter where your generations came from before you. We need you.
And isn't that the American dream in a nutshell? It doesn't matter where you came from. It doesn't matter what your generations before you did. You have that opportunity, or if you don't, it's up to us as Americans to help provide that opportunity to as many young people as possible. Another former guest on the podcast who was with us just a couple of weeks ago is the president and CEO of Fanuc America, the largest robotics company in the world. And Mike Chico is his name. He will talk about students graduating from high school with a one-semester course in advanced robotics and automation, going direct to the workforce, and then and making great money, by the way. We like to say you have a certification in robotics operation and programming. You drive any pickup truck you want right out of high school. A lot of times your employer will pay you to continue your education. In fact, most times. So it's just a great way to start a career pathway. But there are all of these incredible career opportunities for our young people that are available to them and that you're reaching in so many ways through the CHIPS and Science Act, which, by the way, was signed into law by the president in August of last year. So now we're 8 months in. Hard to believe it's been 8 months since that act was signed into law. Tell us a little bit about, are we making progress in these last 8 months, and what progress has been made, and about some of the initiatives that are already going?
Substantial amount of money appropriated in the bill made available. The various agencies, commerce, energy, education, all trying to come up with the programs to implement that. We're in the early stages now of having developed programs and solicited participants and beginning to provide the resources. I'll be honest with you, Matt, we're asking a lot of questions on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee about how these initial efforts were put together, how the money's being allocated, how it appears it's going to be spent. And that's not just because we're snoopy members of Congress, but we have a responsibility to make sure the taxpayers' resources are used to the maximum efficiency, to the greatest possible good. And I'll go one step farther than that and say this, Matt, the incredible amount of money in CHIPS and Science, the $50+ billion, really a fantastic amount of money, but absolutely needed to address this set of issues. But there are other issues out there in a variety of areas, from quantum on down, where we may need this magnitude of an effort, not in the long-term future, but maybe not too far from now. And if I'm going to go back to Congress and say, the $50 billion you provided me made a lot of difference, but I need another tens of billions, I have to be able to prove to the folks back home and my colleagues here in Congress that next tranche of money will be used as wisely as the other. So we're going to ask a lot of questions. We're going to make a lot of inquiries. We're going to have a lot of hearings, but it's our job and it's our responsibility, because the world is changing so fast. Keeping up with the economic competition and scientific competition around the world is going to require, it's just going to require amazing things. And I have to be able to justify it.
As one of those constituents back at home, not yours necessarily, but certainly a proud American, that oversight is exactly what we need, exactly what we want. And I think, here again, on the spirit of bipartisanship, we can find ways to work together when there's incredible opportunity to work on things like chips, to work on things like quantum computing or artificial intelligence or machine learning, all of these advancing technologies that I think we all recognize are changing our world. And if we believe, as I do, in the strong and optimistic future for the United States of America, we have to invest in these areas. So thank you to you and your committee, both Chairman and Congressman, for that oversight and for that leadership, because that is just absolutely incredibly important. We're in a crazy world. We are in a world where geopolitics are what they have never been, and you can't even look at the front page without an article about something that China is up to. And I know that you mentioned them earlier, so I don't mind picking on them in particular. So on the research and science front, and as we continue to talk about chips, Congressman, has CHIPS enabled putting us on the right track to be competitive with China?
Absolutely. The chip side of the chips and science equation, the investments that are made in manufacturing, building the factories, setting up the assembly lines, taking the level of technology we have now to its ultimate form, that's driving an economy, that's driving an enterprise, that's creating the supply that will grow the demand for the end result. The science side of the equation, of course, is about the future. And I must say, in all fairness to one of our leading competitors on the other side of the world, they flatter us. It is clear from the work that we've done on the committee that they have gone back and examined how we've made investments in science and in scientific infrastructure all the way back to the 1930s. And they are lavishly copying what we've done. They're spending incredible amounts of money. I don't know that the average citizen, who I love and have the greatest respect for, may not generally be aware of the national lab system. They may not be generally aware of the universities, both public and private, and their research programs, let alone the amount of money that corporate America spends on research. It's what has brought us to this point we are in the world now. And having our leading competitor try to copy it, spend lavishly, and sometimes be willing to acquire the technology in perhaps a nefarious way if they can't develop it, or purchase the people who literally can develop the technology. That is a form of flattery, but it means we cannot let up. We cannot back off, because if a competitor gets far enough down the road in the pure and basic research, whichever phrase you want to use, to develop the next generation of breakthrough science, we'll have a hard time catching up. And I'm not going to allow that. We mentioned a little while ago the wonders of fusion power. That is important to me, not only because it is a clean power source that will drive the world economy once it's perfected, and what it will do to the climate, it will just reshape the world politically. But it'll also be the technology that once perfected, we will take to the moon and to Mars and the various planets, moons of various planets out there. That's how we go to our next level of existence as human beings. But again, I have to spend the money on the basic research. I've actually had people say to me in my town meetings, Matt, why does the federal government spend all that money on pure research? Why are you investing in STEM things? Can't corporate America do all this? And my polite response has always been, where do you think the PhDs come from? They come from the university program, the training, the research, all those sort of things. Do you think that corporate America can spend the kind of money that we'll spend to develop every STEM skill set? Yes, they want those people, but they can't afford to make that kind of an investment. And furthermore, you don't want one particular enterprise dominating these kind of issues economically. This is like public education. The common good will benefit dramatically.
Absolutely. I've always been a believer in that, certainly limited government. I'm a little right of center. I'm not embarrassed to admit that, but also a believer that the government must do for us what we can't do at the local level or the state level. And certainly in some cases, investing in this innovation is one of those things. All those years in business, Congressman, we used to talk a lot about people are always going to copy you, right? If you come up with a good idea, if you run a great business, and we're in businesses like that now, where everybody else is trying to figure out how can we be more like X. But the trick to that is you've always got to be 2 or 3 steps ahead. And so if somebody else is emulating us, and certainly China always will, the goal in my mind is to be several steps ahead of whether it's them or any other potential adversary, to make sure that we're controlling that technology, that we're not putting ourselves in a position where somebody else can do something that we can't from a scientific or technological standpoint. And that's how you lead. That's how you stay ahead. And that doesn't happen, to your point, without investment across a wide variety of endeavors, including education. And you've touched on this. You've touched on the importance of experiences while young people are growing up. You've talked about the value of creating these PhD engineers that can do the research when they get into private industry, or maybe continue in academia and do really, really important research. Totally agree on that. Let's talk a little bit more about that STEM workforce. And as you think about it, Congressman, whether it's manufacturing, whether it is agriculture, whether it's another endeavor, how do you think about that STEM pipeline and how we create a comprehensive pipeline so that we're getting young people excited about STEM, and then we're giving them the skills and competencies as they go through their education journey to be valuable once they're complete with their initial education journey and then going on to lifelong learning and adding value in the workforce.
We have to make sure that the next generation has an opportunity to know that there is something that we refer to generally as STEM. We also have to make sure that they understand these are good jobs, that we're talking about fields that in a world now where job and job descriptions turn over, it almost seems annually, these are skills that are going to be required, and they're going to be utilized by enterprises that are going to be there for a time. Nothing's guaranteed in life, but if you have these skills, whether you're a machinist creating the components that go into these processes or building the factories, or you're the technician modifying the receiver set on my tractor and adjusting the software on the terminal inside, these are the jobs that are going to be there and be there for the long haul. But again, making sure that young people know what's available, where the needs are, what the reward can be. And that requires exposure. Junior high, high school. That's why in rural STEM, as we've talked so much about, and inner city, it's so important because a lot of those kids, they may know that dad sends or mom sends the tractor down to the dealer to be adjusted, but they may not understand what all that entails. My constituents, for instance, in South Oklahoma City, know that there's a major aerospace industry in Oklahoma, but they may not make that connection with the STEM techs who service and refurbish and remanufacture those planes. We've got to use the public education system, and that also entails having corporate America participate with us so they can say, well, we have a facility in South Oklahoma City, or we have a facility in Woodward, Oklahoma, and here's what we do, here's what our people do. This is the compensation packages that we provide. And oh, by the way, 10% of our positions are vacant right now.
Right.
And if you will secure this level of education, whether it's career tech or community college or some sort of a program, you'll be interviewed almost immediately.
Right.
And we'll fill these positions. And payday is the first day of the month after you've signed on. I know that sounds like an oversimplification, but it is necessary because we live in a world where immediate gratification is the focus of most of our fellow citizens, especially the younger ones. Mm-hmm. And I'm old enough school that I would not have imagined what a smartphone would look like when I went into my freshman year of high school in 1974.
Right.
But they are so consumed by this sort of stuff, we need to help them think outside of the box.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's, it's fascinating.
And it's just cool stuff to do.
It is cool stuff to do. It's exactly right, Congressman. You think about, and there's actually been quite a bit of science and research around how young people select their career pathways. And we talk all the time about how the number one influencer of a young person's career pathway. A lot of times if you ask people that question, you'll say, what's the number one influencer of a young person's career pathway? And they'll say a teacher, or they'll say a parent, or they'll say social media or their friend. And all those things are influencers, and they're all important, of course. But the number one influencer of a young person's career pathway, and this has been proven, is their own interest and experiences when they're in middle school and high school. And when we can spark that interest and get them excited about what that next generation of technology looks like, what it could be to maybe, if precision agriculture specifically isn't in your future, stepping into that implement dealer and working with the smart sensors and the control systems and the satellite connectivity and the cloud computing that has become modern day agriculture. And by the way, that same continuum reoccurs in every vertical in our entire economy, whether it's manufacturing, hospitality, retail. Every single vertical in our economy has that same continuum. We get young people excited about understanding that technology. The closer they get to the automation in terms of a career, the closer they get to the technology, the better that job pays, the more interesting it is. It probably provides more opportunities for advancement, and it's safer. Who wouldn't want a more interesting, better, safer, higher paying job? But you're exactly right. We have to find a way to inspire our young people toward those types of careers. Do you think we're doing that? Are we getting there? What else needs to be done?
I think we're making progress. As I have worked to reach out in my own state as we in the Science Committee have worked through the federal government to encourage them to get the attention of industry to help deliver that message. I think we're making real progress. Now, we got way behind the curve, Matt. You can tell by the deficiency of STEM personnel we have in this great nation, but we're focused now and we're attempting to turn it around. And I believe we'll get that done. And I would add one other thought. My parents were children of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. And my mother was old school, and she had this phrase, which was, you want a clean job. And these STEM positions we're talking about are generally, invariably, almost certainly in good working environments with a lot of other bright people. It's what my mother would define as a clean job.
Absolutely.
And we want those opportunities for the next generation.
We most certainly do, and a visionary in her own right, looking forward all those years ago and saying you want a clean job. That is exactly right. And if you walk into the average now advanced manufacturing environment, for just one example, I mean, it is well lit. The equipment is clean. It's incredibly well organized. It's not dirty. It's not grimy. You're working in many cases in an air conditioned environment around other technicians, around other engineers, or around other people working on the modern day assembly line, which is nothing like the one of the 1980s, much less the 1920s. I mean, these are really, really fulfilling, really amazing jobs. And we just need to get more and more young people excited about them, inspired toward them, and given those skills and competencies they need to be successful when they get there. And credit to you and your leadership on all of these fronts as we move closer and closer to that ultimate goal. You talk about clean manufacturing. We also have a lot of talk around clean energy and advancements in the energy space. And I know this is an area that particularly fascinates you, Congressman. So I would love to hear about your outlook as we twist the conversation a little bit toward energy for the next generation energy technologies. Huge announcements within the last year on things like nuclear fusion and others. What do you think the future holds for the world of energy?
I think, Matt, that we have to maximize the resources we have now. I refer to fossil fuels as the transition fuel until we ultimately get to fusion. That's ultimately where we go. But also, between utilizing more efficiently the traditional energy sources and fusion, the latest generation of traditional fission power plants have come a long ways. And by that I mean, after all, fusion combines atoms, fission splits atoms. Think of the hydrogen bomb and the atomic bomb. But getting to that point, we have to burn our natural gas cleaner. We have to utilize our other hydrocarbons more efficiently. And we spend money on research in this country on that. And I think we're getting there. Matter of fact, we're one of the few places in the world that's had a dramatic reduction in our carbon emissions over the last 20 years because it makes good economic sense and good environmental sense to do these things. But again, ultimately, it's fusion. Give me a process that produces no radiation, that the exhaust consists of a little water, and you have an ocean full of fuel. That's where we ultimately go. And it's not just the United States. The Chinese, the British, the Europeans, the Russians, the entire world is working frantically to get to a practical fusion design, and we'll get there. Matter of fact, not too many months ago, for the first time for a very brief period, we had an initial ignition where more energy was produced than it took to produce the reaction. That's a huge breakthrough.
Yeah, absolutely huge breakthrough, Congressman. And you think, and I like the discussion about fission as well. I mean, if we look at, and certainly, everybody in one degree or another is at least has their eye on climate change, if not concerned about it. And so you think about the ways that we produce energy and how much energy we can create relative to the greenhouse gas emissions that relate to it. And burning wood is incredibly inefficient. And then you have coal, and then you've got petroleum and so on. Then you get to natural gas, and really at the top of the list in terms of the amount of energy we can create with minimal environmental impact now is nuclear fission. So we certainly have opportunities there.
Absolutely, Matt. And the smaller modular plants that are on the designing boards, I always remind people in my town meetings when this comes up, we're not talking about using water to cool facilities anymore, liquid sodium or other mechanisms. I mean, it's been a dramatic shift. And unfortunately, because some challenges back in the 70s, 80s, there's been hesitation, but the technology's kept moving forward. And again, we have to have bridging fuels until we get to that ultimate source, whether it's clean natural gas or more efficient use of oil for that matter. But fission is a part of the recipe to get there.
Exactly. It's an and, not an or, and we need to be focusing on that as well. You and I couldn't agree more on that. We could probably spend an entire half hour or an hour talking just about energy, but we have so many things, Congressman, that we want to pack in with you today. I met a couple of short weeks ago with Governor Doug Burgum from the state of North Dakota, and he was telling me about some of the advancements in drone technology that they're working on up near Grand Forks. And I know that your state and you in particular have a tremendous amount of fascination around things like unmanned aircraft systems, advanced air mobility. So what should our audience know about advances in both policy and technology in those spaces?
The technology is rapidly advancing. Now, remember, the committee is not so much focused on the defense uses of these issues, but on the civilian side. And from an agricultural producer's perspective, you can now buy drones with the capacity to put liquid tanks on them and literally spray for weeds and all manner of stuff. You can use your drones to count your cattle with the electronic ear tags and know exactly buttons, what's going on. The security issues, the surveillance, chasing invasive species, that sort of stuff. We have a problem in Oklahoma with something called feral pigs, and the drones are ultimately going to be a part of that answer of tracking and addressing that issue. But again, it requires technology that is not practical on foot or with existing manned vehicles. My alma mater, Oklahoma State, is very aggressive in this sort of thing. The weather issues, tracking storms and weather patterns and all that sort of stuff. I mean, it is amazing. Now, most of my constituents, when this topic comes up in my town meeting, say, "Oh, you mean they're going to deliver my package with that?" Well, yes, that's a part of it too. But it is a piece of how we make the transportation system and data gathering, being able to respond to these issues more efficient. I'm fascinated, coming from my part of rural Western Oklahoma, I'm fascinated by the drones that are now big enough to be able to apply chemicals to control invasive species of plants and weeds, part of an effort to preserve the integrity of the environment out on the farm. And that didn't exist 10 years ago. It's just, my father used to say, these are the good old days, when my uncle would say the good old days were the past. Technology-wise, and if we utilize our resources, yes, these are the good old days, and tomorrow will even be a better good old day.
Absolutely. Well, we're looking at, and I totally agree with you. I mean, you think about it, and it's so easy to take for granted the advancements in technology that we've seen even in the last 10 years. We've almost got accustomed to it, in terms of, every single week we're reading about or learning about some new technology. I'm totally fascinated by drone technology, whether they're ground drones or flying ones. And there again, it all comes back to how we educate that next generation. I mean, you think about a drone, that is really, it's all smart sensors. It's the same continuum we talked about before. It's smart sensors talking to an Arduino or a control system, usually enabled, almost always enabled by GPS and cloud computing, and now increasingly artificial intelligence and machine learning in all of those platforms. But we need the workforce that is inspired around these technologies, whether it's a young person who's going to work on them as a technician or that PhD that is going to work on advancing the next generation of research around these technologies. It's such an amazing time we live in, and it's such an exciting time to be not just an American, but certainly living on the planet Earth, and so much optimism for where these technologies are taking us. They're also taking us into some really interesting weather forecasting, and I know that's also, Congressman, a fascination of yours. So talk about how we're using some of the technologies that you and I have discussed today to forecast weather in ways we've never been able to do so before.
Bear in mind, my district and where I live is on the east side of the Rockies in the Southern Plains. We can go from 18 below zero in the wintertime to 118 in the summertime. We can have the most intense dry conditions that produce the most frightening wildfires. We can have blizzards. We can have floods, all manner of issues. This remote sensing technology is a part of that. The ability to be able to put equipment at the right place to determine what's going on weather-wise, to be able to take the right images. And it matches up with our satellite capacity. It matches up with our ocean buoys, the monitoring equipment. It matches up with our next generation of radar, which, by the way, in the Science Committee this year, I believe we will all, in this session, we'll authorize the next generation of weather radar. It's been 40 years
Wow.
since we've had a complete rebuild. Can you imagine, Matt, the technology advancements
yeah.
in radar and weather forecasting?
How has that changed, Congressman, if you don't mind me asking? How in terms of that 40-year later generation of radar? I'd be curious to know how that's different.
Well, the way I word it back home in my town meetings, instead of looking at cloud masses, we'll be looking at the temperature of raindrops in the cloud
Wow.
to determine the effect. Our European neighbors have been really successful in the last 10 years about extending farther out their forecasting, both in immediate weather and long-term weather. And that's part of the challenge that we put to the National Weather Service and Science Committee is we should be able to match anybody's intermediate and long-term forecasts. And we are working in that direction, but they've got to have the tools at NOAA in order to do that. And this will be a lively debate. When you are talking about a national radar system, that's a substantial investment, but we'll work our way through it and we'll get it done. See, that's one of the beautiful parts, Matt, about the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. There are a lot of committees in Congress where, I say this respectfully, my colleagues of both stripes, whatever their political affiliation, seem to like to go to the corner and scream at each other. We are, much like the Ag Committee, very team-oriented. How do we address the common goals, the common needs, and move as a unit? That's how we reauthorize the energy research programs in the previous session of Congress. That's how we achieve consensus on the science part of CHIPS and science. We don't scream at each other. We try to work with each other. Now, I'm not questioning the technique or logic of any of my colleagues.
Sure.
I just know it's better to get things done.
No question. Yeah, to be able to work on that type of a platform with that level of collaboration, and that, frankly, it gives you a little bit of optimism for the future and maybe perhaps what government can be as we look at what makes us Americans as opposed to maybe what separates us. And in my mind, if you look back over history, there's a lot more that makes us the same than makes us different. Than we need to stay focused on that. Representative Frank Lucas from Oklahoma is our guest here on the Tech Ed podcast. Congressman, we have time for just one last question for you.
Okay.
I've really enjoyed this fascinating conversation. You're a brilliant individual and have just a tremendous amount of knowledge on such a wide range of topics. We're going to turn to a topic that I think you know really, really well, and we're going to go back in time. And we're going to go all the way back in time. I think if I remember correctly, you said 1974-ish that you were
freshman in high school. Yes,
in high school. So maybe you're sophomore in 1975. Gerald Ford is the president, I think, shortly before the election of Jimmy Carter. So we're going back a little ways, but go all the way back to being that 15-year-old young man on that farm in this great state of Oklahoma. And if you had one piece of advice, Congressman, for that young man that you could go back in time and deliver to him, what would that be?
Well, Matt, I'm going to offer you 3 pieces because
Awesome.
Thinking about when I was 15 years old. First piece, I started following my future wife around when I was a freshman in high school. And if I were talking to 15-year-old Frank Lucas, I would say, calm down, you'll get the girl eventually. Just be calm. Piece number 2, I would have told my young self that when I was able to make some money at some point in the future, invest in the economic and the scientific base of this country. I should have been buying those stocks when I ultimately, and I didn't have money for that when I was 15,
Sure,
but ultimately investing in the capacity and the future of this country, because that's those little pieces of equity we can all share in the success.
100%.
Point number 3, I probably would remind myself at 15, study harder, work harder, because I could not have understood in a world where we still had rotary dial phones on party lines, a world where there were no computers, everything was mechanical, essentially, except transistors, of course, but a lot of agriculture was. I would advise myself to work even harder than I did to expand my mind and my capacity for the challenges we'd all face together. So, number 1, be calm. You got the girl eventually. Number 2, invest in America because it would reward you wonderfully. And number 3, work harder at learning more to add to one's capacities for the future.
And Congressman, I'm going to submit that advice is as relevant today as it probably would have been 50 years ago to that young sophomore in high school who's thinking about their future. Certainly be patient when it comes to romance and probably many other things. Secondly, make sure you're investing in the future of technology, because I am one that believes that as exciting as the last 50 years have been from a technological and science standpoint, the next 50 years and probably even the next 10 years are going to be that much more interesting. And no matter what it is that you're putting your mind to, work harder at that and the benefits will arise. And that's just great advice, Congressman, for any of us, including that 15-year-old young individual. This has been awesome. It's been such a pleasure to have you on in a wide range of topics, from public policy to technology to your background. You're a fascinating individual, and just can't thank you enough, Congressman, for spending some time with us on the Tech Ed podcast.
Absolutely. I've enjoyed it immensely, Matt.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and if you like this episode, share it with a friend. New episodes launch every Tuesday, so listen in next week.